Okay, welcome everybody, and let's get going. As always, I want to thank Alec Julian, who is acting as producer and engineer and MC and question master and our kind of person we call to for deep philosophical questions, and also to Patricia Julian, who composed our theme music. As usual, what I'm going to do is talk directly to you as much as I can, and then we'll go to PowerPoint, and I'll actually read stuff, which I hate doing. I can't stand watching people on a screen just reading from a piece of paper, but the stuff I have to say, I think, is worth saying well. And let's face it, when we want to get our ideas straight, we write things down. So today we're going to talk about two sets of myths, what might be thought of as an ancient and a modern set of myths. And both of them have to do with the notions of the origins of writing. In particular, I think you'll find them interesting because of what they tell us about the meaning of writing and the importance of writing. Okay, so let's move on to our first slide now. All right, so when I first started carving the endangered alphabets, especially when I was doing the project that you can see here, which was a short poem in these 4 different panels in 20 different minority scripts, more and more I started having in my mind, imagining this writing creation myth. And in my mind, what was happening is that there was some god or goddess, let's say Athena, who takes a mortal and leads them into a sort of a sacred grove. So they're surrounded by trees. And Athena does the thing with the fingernail and the finger and goes, and the tree falls in half, and in the half that's standing, there are these marks, these things that are sort of organized and regular, but of course the mortal has no idea what they actually are. And the goddess says, "This is writing. Use it for everything." And so I was cherishing this little personal mythological fantasy, assuming that this was just the result of too much carving too late at night. And then I began discovering that, in fact, a lot of cultures have writing creation mythologies, and certainly deities. So, for example, in Egypt, the god Thoth was held to be the inventor of writing, the creator of languages, the scribe, the interpreter, and the advisor of the gods, which is really interesting. And I'll come back to this, the idea that the writer is the interpreter of the gods. And in Hindu religion, Saraswati has a similar kind of role. And of course, at the time, being very Western and feeling superior, I was thinking, oh yes, these are just superstitions. But eventually, I sort of got out of that, and I began to realize that what a myth does is to explain what is important. And the very fact that we had these explanations of creation, how the world came to be, how one's people came to be, and the fact that they incorporated writing was really important for many reasons. One was that they saw writing as being so magical, so significant, they couldn't imagine it had been invented by humans. And that's not me saying they are superstitious and dim. It's saying, isn't it interesting, therefore, how they understood the power and the remarkable qualities of writing? In the West, we don't get that, partly because we are much more secular, but also partly because our script is used so much throughout the world, and it's used in such a mundane fashion that we barely notice it. We recognize that it is okay, it's important, but we jot down grocery lists with it. You know, we send texts in it. And so the notion of writing as being something remarkable is almost a non-starter in the West. Once I began voyaging out among the endangered alphabets, however, I began seeing things very differently. So here is a story from the Zhuang people, who are an ethnic minority of southern China. So their creation epic tells the story of how a primordial god named Bao Rou brought the Zhuang people not just one script, but two. One was called Soigurk, or root script, and one was called Soiva, or insect script, sort of describing how the letters looked. And this was a particularly rich gift, as I say here, consisting of 4,000 glyphs, which suggests these were pictographic or meaning-based writing systems rather than phonetic systems. And this god also gave them the gift of fire. Now, as with many gifts from the gods, according to this epic, the novelties proved to be too much too soon. The Zhuang, not understanding fire, stored both fire and writing together in a hut with a thatched roof. And the building burned down, and with it, the Zhuang lost the knowledge of writing. So to me, this is absolutely an extraordinary narrative, because we think of fire as being one of the inventions or discoveries or adaptations that made human beings different from the great apes, that enabled us to make that step in so many ways that we regard as being central to what we call evolution and civilization, all that kind of stuff. So we kind of go, yes, fire, very important. And the Zhuang are equating the importance of writing with the importance of fire. That is absolutely extraordinary. Next slide, please. And here we have, these are the Zhuang who are laughing at my pitiful attempts to pronounce words in their language. Okay. I want to talk next about the Mandaeans. So the Mandaeans have one of the most extraordinary alphabets in the world because of the way they understand writing. Each letter has a mystical meaning, and every word, therefore, is charged and radiant with enlightenment. The word Mandaean or Mandaic comes from their word Manda, which means knowledge, in this case, not knowledge of just everyday things, but knowledge in the sense of knowledge of the divine or enlightenment. So they see themselves as the enlightened people. And one of their origin stories concerns the structural development, so to speak, of their alphabet, which is, in their mind, not just a series of symbols that are set up in some kind of arbitrary sequence beginning to end, but as a spiritual union in which the first letter is also the last, which means that the alphabet, instead of being a sequence, kind of turns like the earth around the sun, or the sun above the earth. It is an alphabet that is rooted in their minds in the heavens. Next slide. Oh, we're on the next slide already. Huh. So in this account, the way that they talk about the divine development of their alphabet is actually in architectural terms. So I'm going to quote from it. So in their mind, the first letter is their letter for what we would call A, which is really interesting because it's circular. It's a circle in itself. And then each of the other letters emerge from that, sort of like Athena emerging from the head of Zeus. Is that right? Anyway, so each of the letters emerges from its predecessor until 23 of them came into existence. And each praised and worshipped its predecessor until they formed a new kind of structure, a wall, spreading out to the right and the left from the middle letter. And the middle letter, therefore, is the builder's clay, kind of the keystone that holds everyone together. It's the letter L. But they recognized that being a wall, it's only standing for itself. And it can't support anything else. And so the letters realized that if they joined hands and they formed a circle coming back to the letter A, then they would have a solid foundation. And so A became the wellspring from which they emerged, and also the crown on top of their heads. And only then, I'm quoting from the text now, did it become possible to name all things and to speak every mystery, because language is not possible without, again, this is a quote, this indivisible republic of letters. Now, that is an absolutely extraordinary notion. The word republic suggests that the letters are self-governing, in addition to being obviously alive and sentient. And indivisible suggests that all knowledge grows out of the fact that they have these letters. The letters therefore become, as it were, the DNA base pairs of life itself. And once again, we don't think in those terms because we don't think about writing. The Mandaeans think about writing and have thought about writing for so long, for over 2,000 years, that their alphabet has barely changed. If you see a piece of writing that is centuries old, it is still perfectly legible because each letter is in itself a manifestation of divinity. And you don't want to mess with that, right? So one of the ways in which many cultures, including Christianity, see the act of creation of the universe is that the creator has a thought and manifests that thought into three-dimensional reality. Interestingly enough, writing does the same thing. It takes something that is invisible and immaterial, namely a thought that we have, and it makes it visible, tangible, available to other people, habitable, so to speak. Next slide. So we've jumped over one. Yes, right. So the Mandaeans have such a regard for writing that they have two creation myths, one of which is the myth or the narrative of the creation of the universe. And the creator of the universe, the physical universe, is known as the Light King. But in one of their sacred documents, the Light King sees writing for the first time and is, as the English say, gobsmacked. And what he says is, who created these? I did not, therefore there must be one mightier than I. So that is really extraordinary, because the creator of the universe is saying that the creation of writing is more profound and more significant than the creation of the universe itself. So that's one way of understanding how other cultures have thought about writing. Another way of seeing how other cultures recognize the importance of writing, and especially the importance of having one's own script, can be seen in what we might call script loss mythologies. And these are especially common in the highland region that straddles Southeast Asia, southern China, and the northeast corner of South Asia, which is a region that has been dubbed Zomia. So the colored area here with the little mountains is the area that has recently been called Zomia, and it's been given a name that straddles national borders because it has a kind of identity of its own. This is an upland region, not easily explored, not easily penetrated, certainly not easily farmed. And all of the major kingdoms of the area tended to be on the lowland territory, which was much more fertile, where transportation was easier, et cetera, et cetera. And so Zomia became, over centuries, an area of refuge, with migrants and refugees fleeing there from the great powers of, for example, China and the King of Burma. And so what we see is a history of peoples who had until that point been stable and presumably literate. They were forced to flee, and they became sort of refugee minorities settling in small pockets in the upland hills. And in their narratives of the creation of writing, it is almost invariably, once again, a divine creation and a divine gift. But in these narratives, that gift is lost or stolen or destroyed or taken away from them. And these are stories that are often extraordinarily moving, and also often incorporate, as we saw with the Zhuang story, a sense that the people themselves were to blame. The Zhuang, they put the writing in the hut with the fire, it burned down. And there are many narratives in which something like this happens. For example, the Aka, it said, kept their writing on buffalo skins, but were forced to eat the skins because they were starving when they were fleeing from the Thai armies that were invading their land. The Wa also wrote on oxhide that, once again, in hard times was eaten. The Lahu wrote their letters on cakes that met the same fate. The writing of the Hmong was destroyed by the Chinese or eaten by horses, etc., etc. What is particularly interesting about these narratives is that there are ways in which they seem to echo down to the present day. So one of the Hmong narratives of how we had and we lost writing, namely not only our letters, but our ability to understand writing, to practice writing, to teach writing to our children, etc. One of their narratives is that they were being chased by the Chinese. And so what they did was to hide their letters in their embroideries, because Hmong embroidery is extremely beautiful and elaborate. In doing so, they thought, right, we can save our writing, and even if we're captured or overrun by the Chinese, they won't know that this is writing. So can we have the next slide? And of course, one of the things that happened is that in hiding their writing in amongst their embroidery, they lost the ability to read it. And so there is this terribly poignant notion that if only we could read our own embroidery, we would rediscover our writing, and with it, our sense of dignity, our sense of place, our sense of purpose, our sense of belonging. And interestingly enough, there are many cultures that have embroideries that tell stories. And in fact, this is a Hmong story or narrative piece of embroidery. They're sometimes called story maps. And so if you look in the top left-hand corner, you can see that, and they're being, obviously this is a much more modern version, that they are being bombed. All of those disasters and people lying down are casualties, and they're being forced to flee. So that top row is the Hmong people carrying out their everyday acts of, subsistence agriculture. And then by the time we get to the bottom, they're forced to flee in boats. And they wind up at the very bottom right as refugees, which is, a terrible status, and one that completely undermines their sense of who they are. And interestingly enough, this notion that that they hid their writing from the Chinese in their embroidery actually may have basis in fact, because we know of at least one source which mentions a decree, a Chinese decree, banning the remaining Hmong from using or teaching writing. So again, this is the importance of writing. The Han Chinese know that one way to subjugate the Hmong is to keep them illiterate, or to force them to become illiterate and to keep them illiterate. And in one of my later talks, I'll actually go into this in more detail and quote you some of these script loss narratives in greater detail. And the Karen people, for example, very poignantly and bitterly talk about how they have been treated like dogs everywhere they go, because they don't have writing, and in particular, they don't have their own writing. So it would be really easy to dismiss these writing creation narratives as being mere superstitions. This is, in fact, what we in the West love to do when we're talking about other cultures who are non-Hellenic or non-Eurocentric. And the joke is on us, because right at the heart of the Judeo-Christian tradition is what I believe is a writing creation myth that we pass on almost daily, certainly weekly. It's part of our collective knowledge as I say, the Judeo-Christian people, and it has many, many, many features in common with some of these other writing myths we've seen. Okay, so let's set the scene. It's the book of Exodus. Right, so Moses has led the Israelites out of Egypt, and they are sort of wandering in the desert, and you would think they would be grateful, but no, they are grumbling, they are a rabble, they are constantly bickering among themselves, they're constantly disputing Moses' leadership. In other words, they're just one of many nomadic or semi-nomadic Middle Eastern people. Okay. And so what happens is that Moses goes up onto the mountain to talk with the Lord, and the Lord decides, okay, this is a mess. I am going to give you the law. I am going to tell you how you have to live if you are to be my chosen people. And he goes into it in great detail. And this is just a little bit so this is just about observing the Sabbath, but there is a lot more in terms of what is called the covenant. A covenant is a contract, right? So it's the contract. If you obey this, I will be your leader and protector, says the Lord. Now, look at the bottom. When the Lord finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of the covenant law, the tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God. Now, that is really powerful stuff. We say, in order to show how something is credible or legal, we say, I've got it in writing. If something is going to be significant and permanent, we say, it's written in stone. And so here we have the divine covenant written by, right there in those words, the finger of God. So writing is at the absolute heart of the connection between the deity and the people. Okay, so let's move on to the next. So what happens? Moses turned around and went back down the mountain with the 2 tablets of covenant law in his hand. They were inscribed on both sides, front and back. The tablets were the work of God. The writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. Okay, you know, this could not be made any clearer. This has been underlined many times. This is the thinking of God. It's the work of God. It's the writing of God. And that is about as powerful a statement that you can make about the connection between order and the conditions of civilization and a stable society, as you can imagine. And unfortunately, of course, things don't go well. And here is Rembrandt's painting of Moses breaking the tablets of the law, because, of course, he comes down to find that the Israelites have taken all of their gold and they've melted it down and they've made it into a graven image, an idol, and they're busy worshiping that instead. And he is so furious, and this is, again, really interesting, he breaks the writing. Interestingly enough, he doesn't break them. He doesn't hit them with the tablets. He is so furious at them and their intransigence, he breaks the writing. And then he goes back and talks to God again. Okay, next slide. The Lord said to Moses, chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write on them the words that were on the first tablets. But the interesting thing is, the Lord God doesn't do that. He actually gives dictation. So the Lord said to Moses, write down these words, for in accordance with these words, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. And so he goes again through all of the law and he gives dictation, and Moses writes it down. And so in my mind, this is a really interesting mythological step, because God is transferring the power of writing with all of its divine authority and its ability to set out secular law to Moses. And so at this is the point at which Moses becomes the unquestioned leader of his people. And so I contend that this story is a writing creation myth. Like many writing creation myths, it equates writing with the birth of civilization, with law and order, with a stable and settled society, with the beginnings of knowledge. And I'm sorry if you're one of these people who believes the Bible is literally true word for word. I'm sorry if I'm sort of upsetting that. But to me, looking at it from the point of view of writing, it seems to me that this passage is about the translation, if you like, of the Israelites from this rabble, this polytheistic, intransigent rabble, into a stable civilization. Okay, so as I've said before, in the civilized West, we don't believe, apparently, in these mythological narratives. We believe in evolution. And what I'm going to do is look at this notion, which is almost uniformly held here, which is that writing has evolved, and in particular, that writing has evolved into the Latin alphabet. So what I'm going to do is to start by quoting from I don't want to bash anybody, so I'm not going to identify this, but this is a thoroughly reputable source that is presenting this information not as a theory, not as a conjecture, but as fact. So let's have a look at this really closely. I quoted from this very briefly last talk, but let's look at it here. Writing has been invented independently in the Near East, China, and Mesoamerica. Okay, 3 different places independently invented or developed writing. The Cuneiform script created in Mesopotamia or present-day Iraq around 3200 BC was first. It's also the only writing system which can be traced back to its earliest prehistoric origin. The antecedent of the cuneiform script was the system of counting and recording goods with clay tokens. So one thing that's really important to notice here, the writer has identified 3 different sources for the genesis, the birthplace of writing, but is only focusing on one, apparently because this is the one that was first and can be traced back, and dismisses or kind of passes over the other 2 completely. The Mesopotamian cuneiform script can be traced furthest back into prehistory to an 8th millennium BC counting system using clay tokens of multiple shapes. The development from tokens to scripts reveals that writing emerged from counting and accounting. That is presented as fact, and it is flat out not true. It is possibly true in the case here, but it's certainly not true in the genesis and birthplace of writing in China or in Mesoamerica. That is not where writing emerged from, counting and accounting. In fact, it emerged from, at least in China, out of magic. Now, next point, the evolution of writing from tokens to pictography, syllabary, and then alphabet illustrates the development of information processing to deal with larger amounts of data in ever greater abstraction. So a couple of things there. There's a clear sense of evolution. So don't forget, evolution, apart from anything else, means getting better. And that's one of the things that I'm going to challenge. This also sounds really convincing because it's in the language of computing, information processing, data. It sounds as if this person really, really knows what they are talking about. And this definition strikes me as being wrong in so many ways. It strikes me as being condescending, misleading, and frankly, a little weaselly. So let's move on. The way in which it strikes me as condescending is the assumption that anything that is old cannot be as good as anything that is new. And stuff evolved because it wasn't good and could be made better. So this is a fragment of the artwork on the wall of the Chauvet cave in southern France. It is probably 37,000 years old. I cannot draw anything like that well, not to mention the fact that this was being done with very limited means under very difficult conditions. So older is not necessarily more primitive or worse. We make that assumption because it makes us feel good. And in particular, it makes us feel good about the decisions that we make and have made. That's very important. We'll come back to that in just a minute. Okay. So one of the other ways in which I think that definition is really, really misleading is that it talks about writing as having emerged out of counting and accountancy. And I want to talk a little bit about how we think about the past. The way we think about the past typically is by projecting our own values backwards and then judging what we find of the past on the basis of those values. And what I'm going to argue is that we like to think, we in the West, I've said before at the beginning of last talk, when I say we, I mean the privileged West, etc., like to think of writing as originating in counting and accountancy and ownership and all this kind of stuff, because that's how we think of it. For us, writing is a tool. It's something that is used in, especially nowadays, in little bits of data. And so the idea that it is in any way miraculous or remarkable has long been lost. And because we've lost that, we cannot think of it in those terms. Writing for us, ironically, even though we use writing so much, we've lost sight of it precisely because it's so mundane. It's no longer a miracle, it's no longer an art, it's just something we use for making grocery lists and texting people. So it's not surprising then that we see this evidence from Mesopotamia as being evidence that, oh yes, this is in fact just as we thought, it's used for making grocery lists. So where then did this idea of writing evolving come from? So I'm going to talk you through this, and it is a fascinating process, which is certainly racist, certainly colonial, very Eurocentric and Hellenist. These are qualities that most people just never stop to think about because we're the ones who wrote the history. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So as far as I can tell, the first person to propose the idea of evolution was Rousseau, who equated pictograms with savage people, with ideograms for barbaric people, and the alphabet with civilized people. And this idea then was picked up again in the 19th century, the heyday of colonialism. And we'll look at this slide here. So in Ancient Society, 1877, Lewis Henry Morgan argued that writing, especially the written alphabet, and by that, of course, I mean the written Latin alphabet, was the sole innovation that marked the passage of humankind from what he called the upper status of barbarism to the final and consummate status of civilization. So in a sense, this is just like Moses and the tablets. Only here what we have is somebody who claims to be a scientist and who claims to be looking at evolution as a science, saying that that writing really is what makes the difference between the primitive and the civilized. And at roughly the same time, this general passage was broken down into linguistic stages by one of the earliest and most influential cultural anthropologists, who argued that as a culture evolved, its writing system evolved. Edward Burnett Tyler, blah, 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 proposed that writing progressed from ideograms through to verbal, syllabic, and finally alphabetic glyphs, each step denoting the intellectual and social progress of that society, presumably towards the society that he lived in, which is an Anglo-Victorian ideal. Notice how closely the language there echoes the language of that contemporary definition that we heard a couple of slides ago. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And so here we have Rudyard Kipling, who was kind of the storyteller of the British Empire. Great writer, very entertaining, very convincing. And this is how he tells the story of the evolution of writing. And of course, he's telling it in the Just So stories, which are stories for children. So he really is embedding this belief into the cultural learning of his time. And he goes, and after thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and after hieroglyphics and demotics and nilotics and cryptics and kufics and runics, the fine old, easy, understandable alphabet got back into its proper shape again. So for a children's story, you know, this sounds great, but there are so many things wrong with that. So first of all, if we look in the latter part of it, the word old and the word again imply that the Latin alphabet predated Egyptian hieroglyphics. Wrong. The word easy, the fine, old, easy, understandable alphabet. So that's wrong for a bunch of reasons. First of all, it implies that the Latin alphabet is really easy to learn and to use for denoting the spoken languages of English, French, etc., etc. And frankly, that's not really true. Secondly, if you talk to anybody who is learning our alphabet and our languages from elsewhere in the world, they will say, no, that frankly is not easy. And thirdly, one of the great ironies here is that a pictographic or ideographic script without words is far easier to understand, whatever language you speak, than an alphabet which is tethered to as a phonetic system for a particular language. So what we've got then is the word evolution as a kind of cultural self-justification. If we saw the alphabet evolving to its present status, and we are top dogs, then the alphabet must therefore be the best form of writing. Conversely, and this is a really interesting notion, it was also argued that we became top dogs because the alphabet is the best form of writing. And you may find that hard to understand or swallow, but I'm going to go into that right now. So let's move on to the next slide. So you would think that all of this imperial colonial stuff would die out with the British Empire, but no. If anything, it became more sophisticated and more outrageous. So this is a quote from a contemporary, the introduction to a contemporary book, Social and Cultural Contexts of Historic Writing Practices. And these are three scholars who actually specialize in the origins of writing. So they actually know what they're talking about. Research into writing was, to a large extent, defined as a field by Ignace Gelb's seminal work, A Study of Writing, 1963. So Gelb really did several things that were extremely influential, not in good ways. One was that he argued that the formal elements of writing systems evolved historically from a logographic to an alphabetic form, which is what we're talking about now. But the other thing, and I talked about this last week, he essentially disregarded other aspects of writing practices, considering them to be a matter for other research areas. And this is largely why we have goodness knows how many specialties within linguistics which focus on spoken language, and there is absolutely no comparable set of specialties in the study of written languages, which is where obviously the Endangered Alphabets project comes in. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the same authors continuing. During the mid to late 20th century, a highly influential school of linguists and anthropologists proposed that the invention of alphabetic writing marked a sea change in human cognition, culture, and civilization. They, and in particular a guy called Havelock, argued that the creation of the Greek alphabet was unique in first bringing about large-scale literacy. It allowed human thought to transcend the limitations of the oral mind and permitted sophisticated philosophy, logic, and scientific inquiry. And according to this formulation, the creation of the alphabet is directly responsible for all the higher forms of human thought. This, of course, comes as news to the Chinese, who were doing all the higher forms of human thought before the Greeks. Okay, next slide. Again, two of the three same authors. The West's historically rooted cultural and political hegemony has allowed these socialized within it to normalize privilege and arguably fetishize the alphabet. By the way, we never call it the Latin alphabet because, as far as we're concerned, it's the only one, or the only one that matters. In ways that are less open to users of writing systems without such a cross-cultural global reach and centers of political and ideological dominance to back it up. What that means is, because we are top dogs in terms of military expansionism, it allows us to say our alphabet is privileged, fetishized, it's normalized. And as a perfect illustration of this, here I am, I'm the founder of the Endangered Alphabets project, but because I grew up in this area of the West, I can only read and write one script. I can't read and write any of these things that I carve. Whereas if you go to South Asia, you find that pretty much any educated person actually can move back and forth between 3 and 4 scripts very readily, often more. We are so centered on the fact that we can use just one script that we make the assumption that we only need to, and that what's more important, it is the only script and everything else that is inferior. Okay. And just to finish this quote, the temptation has been to see alphabetic writing as the pinnacle of the development of human writing, with other writing systems either implicitly or explicitly relegated to primitive stages on the way. And again, this is the Victorian explorers seeing writing systems or symbol systems and going, oh yes, this is childish picture writing. We are superior to it. And therefore, of course, not studying and not understanding the value of such systems, which we're going to go into in just a minute. And by the way, the same claim, the same line of argument for a long time was advanced to say that Chinese, because it's not an alphabet and because it has its roots in pictographic and ideographic systems, must be inferior and must be less well suited to abstract thought. The whole idea is that our alphabet, because it's a set of abstract symbols, it enables us to think abstractly and philosophically in a superior fashion. So the fact that, of course, next slide, please. The fact that Confucius was writing roughly 2,500 years ago and was perfectly capable of abstract thought at a time when in Northern Europe, there were no writing systems to be worthy of the name whatsoever, is something that was completely ignored and dissed until amazingly recently. Okay, so this argument of the evolution of writing is a myth, and it's a myth that, like all myths, represents and justifies our common assumptions. So, in fact, what I'm going to do is to argue that what we have seen in the West is not an evolution at all, but actually a narrowing. And it's a narrowing in such a fashion that we have deemed it better to create a set of abstract phonetic symbols to the exclusion of all sorts of other qualities that other writing systems have, such as the fact that, for example, many writing systems, especially some newly created ones, have symbols that actually look like various shapes that the people of that culture know. And so they're easily learned by children because it's like, oh, that shape there, I recognize that. It looks like the beak of a hornbill. And our word for hornbill is this, and therefore the first sound of our word for a hornbill is the sound of that letter. If you go into an elementary school classroom, you see A, you see the word apple, you see a picture of an apple, which looks nothing like the letter A. Other writing systems use this, which makes great sense in terms of, learning. Okay, but I want to talk about other things other signs that we are beginning to recognize the limitations of this narrowing and hyper-focusing that I argue has taken place with our alphabet. Next slide, please. So here are European road signs. So these are, technically speaking, ideograms. They are images that represent ideas. A couple of them are sort of pictographic. But the remarkable thing about these is that if you take a road journey of, say, 250 miles in Europe, you're likely to go through maybe like 4 different countries, all of whom speak different languages. And so therefore, road signs that are word-based, such as most of the ones that you see in the United States, would be extremely confusing and only of local value. And they also assume certain levels of literacy even within the native population. What you have here then is an illustration of a kind of symbol system that carries really important information that can be grasped in a fraction of a second because they're made to be recognized at speed. You're driving up to them, you need to be able to see quickly what's going on, what's coming up, which way to turn, etc., etc. So these signs convey, show that visual images can do a much better job than phonetic writing at processing and conveying large amounts of data. So remember that definition again, which said, you know, our writing gets better and better at conveying large amounts of data? No, there are all kinds of complex data that are much better conveyed by this kind of symbol than by phonetic letters and words. So these, I remember these road signs as coming out when I was a kid, which is, you know, 50s, 60s, etc., maybe 70s. Another revolution that took place in terms of realizing that we needed, or we wanted to do more with writing than our writing was allowing us to do, happened when the PC revolution took hold, which was essentially from the mid-1980s onward. Up until that point, what had really ruled was a whole kind of Times New Roman mentality. But when PCs came out, and especially when kids got hold of them, they wanted more colorful, more interesting fonts, fonts that made a statement purely by their design. Writing became more graphic. So here we have just chosen at random a screen grab from dafont.com, which has tens of thousands of fonts. And the fact that people have created them and people are using them shows that we actually like, at certain times, our writing not to be Times New Roman, but actually to convey other kinds of information as well. Information that might be thought of as a certain sense of feel, or a certain sense of subtext, or a certain sense of context. And the whole idea of abstract symbols, like letters, is a way of avoiding that kind of context. And what I'm arguing is that we know we want more than that from writing. We want writing to do more. And the introduction of these bundles of fonts, which quickly became really numerous and widespread, showed that we really wanted to do more with writing as a form of self-expression. Likewise, as soon as emojis became available, we started using them as a way to convey various kinds of immediate emotional éclat that would be far more laborious to put into words and would take far longer. So here, for example, is one of my favorite emojis and one of my daughter's favorite emojis. And it's extremely hard to say exactly what this conveys in words. But when, for example, somebody, yes, Walter, exactly. So that was an emoji that was originally done alphanumerically and has now obviously been done graphically as well. So when somebody shows appalling and frustrating stupidity and says something to you that you can't believe they said that, and it leaves you with like no option as to like, now what do I do? You kind of go, or like that, and that's it. So it conveys a face. But here's the thing. As humans, we are extraordinarily well-educated and well-versed in reading faces. Faces convey incredibly subtle amounts and vast amounts of information. And so in terms of compressing large amounts of data into a small space, a face or a representation of a face is, yes, thank you, Alec, exactly, who knew, is a wonderful means of conveying complex emotional information between people who are very accustomed to reading faces. And here's one of the interesting arguments, this evolution thing, which I'm going to throw down. So one of the arguments against Chinese was, oh, this is a ridiculous system. You know, it's got 6,000 characters. How would you learn all of those characters? It's impossible. But the fact is, if you look at a bunch of emoji, that you can see 6,000 emoji, and every single one of those is perfectly clear and transparent what it means. And of course, anybody who is actually Chinese, who is looking at Chinese script, is seeing certain hints and traditional glyphs that also give clues as to meaning. So again, the argument that the alphabet is best because it doesn't look like anything and it's purely abstract, and therefore it's better than a vast symbol system, assumes that that symbol system is abstract and in a sense meaningless. Okay, so and do a little bit of wrap up here. And I need to glance at my notes, I'm sorry. What we're seeing then, as I've said, is not an evolution, but a divergence. Okay, so for the Greeks, the word graphos meant both drawing and writing. And we saw it over the last 2,000 years as being a sign of intellectual and cultural progress to separate the two and to focus on writing as the means by which the highest fruits of civilization were transferred. And what I'm arguing is that, in fact, what we're now seeing is the beginning of a reunion between the two streams of that bifurcation. And I'm going to be talking more in my talk about writing beyond writing, about a number of symbol systems around the world that really use symbols in a much broader and more interesting and flexible way than our writing system. But perhaps the most insidious result of this evolutionary view of the alphabet is that it implies, firstly, that non-alphabetic forms of writing should be allowed to die out because they're inferior and primitive. And their place should be taken by the one true alphabet. And apart from anything else, that leaves us with nowhere to go. It leaves us with Rudyard Kipling sitting in our armchair, talking to our children, making assumptions about, yes, we are, of course, superior to everybody else. And there's no reason to be curious about or to try and learn from all of these other cultures around the world. And my contention is that, in fact, it's only by going out among these other cultures and amongst the endangered alphabets that we can actually start learning about writing and its uses and its potential. We don't see this, as I said last week, because history has been written by the winners in the alphabet of the winners. The only reason, in fact, why, and this is what the authors I was quoting earlier were saying, the only reason why the Latin alphabet is triumphant at the moment is because at various crucial times in history, it has been on the side of more lawyers, guns, and money than somebody else. I'm going to take questions in a minute, but first I want to reiterate what I said at the end of last talk, which is that I must beseech you to support our current Kickstarter campaign. So it may seem as if these talks and the Kickstarter are two entirely different things. No, they're exactly the same thing, because I am not working on an academic salary. I don't have a research grant. I'm not part of an institute. I'm not part of a non-profit that is funded by, for example, an agency of government. Almost our only and certainly our main source of funding is our Kickstarter campaigns. If you're interested in this stuff that I'm talking about, I'm going to say you have to support our Kickstarters, because without them, there would be no Endangered Alphabets project, and this thinking about writing would not be taking place. So when this talk is finished and recorded, I'm going to send out an email to everybody who took part with the link to the recording of today's talk and the registration information for next week's talk, but also the link to our Kickstarter. And I have to say to you, if you don't support us, this cannot carry on. That's not a threat, it's just a financial reality. So please give that some serious thought. And now I will take questions. Okay, Alec is in charge of the questions, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your points and your suggestions and your, not necessarily your abuse, but sometimes that happens.
Asking for abuse, that's brave. We had an interesting little discussion about what evolution really is and how it might apply to language or not, but there's no real questions in the chat right now.
So yes, evolution essentially becomes a metaphor. We look at it as a biological principle, and therefore we sort of, it behooves us, it makes us feel better to imply it to, for example, social principles or intellectual principles. And whenever you stop and think about that in any kind of clear fashion, the analogy is only that. It's only an analogy, and in many instances, it just doesn't hold up.
I have a raised hand here.
Yeah.
Salikoko, sorry if I'm mutilating your name.
Yes, thank you, Tim, for exposing the European colonial bias towards non-Europeans. But at the same time, I think there is a whole lot more that you could have said. The Europeans didn't invent the alphabet. They cannot take, they cannot claim inventing the alphabet. They borrowed it from Semitic people, and I think it was from the Phoenicians. And we don't know whether the Phoenicians really took it from the Egyptians' hieroglyphs or from the cuneiforms from the Middle East. And one thing that we should know too is that it's only a handful of 4 years produced writing. The rest of us have been borrowing from each other. If you take China in relation to Korea and in relation to Japan, there's been a lot of cross-fertilization in the development of writing systems. And so without really exposing all that, you are painting a picture that is just partial. And I would like to know if there are modern linguists that buy into that, about the evolution of writing system, because the literature that I know talks about alternative writing systems rather than all writing systems evolving from the same model. It's not really evident the alphabetic system evolved from the logographic system.
Yes, thank you so much for pointing that out. So I'm going to talk a lot more about non-alphabetic systems and also the importance of indigenous writing systems in the remaining talks during my series of 5 talks. And unfortunately, there are modern linguists who still hold this very Eurocentric or Hellenic view of writing. Okay, so yes, let's, I've got some other questions coming in. Alec, what else have we got?
I have something else to add if you allow me.
Okay, sure, go ahead.
Just last night I was reading an article about the Chinese Lu Chen, complaining that the Chinese writing system is complex and difficult to learn. Not necessarily because it is not alphabetical, but because as the system evolved, the iconicity becomes less and less obvious in the system. And if you combine several systems in the same square and the squares are all of the same size, there are some signs that are difficult to interpret. And so he was arguing in the early 20th century for simplifying the writing system, and not necessarily for the alphabetical system, but for a system that would be easier to learn, and according to him, a system that would become more efficient.
Yes. So the Chinese have actually, over the last 75 years, have actually gone back and forth in terms of whether it's better to have a script that represents their cultural traditions and history, or whether it's better to have a system that is more efficient and, for example, can be typed more quickly. And there's a fantastic Radiolab episode, which I'm going to put the name of in the chat right now. Send chat to everyone in meeting. Okay, there's a Radiolab episode called The Wabi Effect. Radiolab, I'll just put that in as well. It's a podcast, and that is absolutely fascinating in terms of the struggles that take place even within Chinese leadership about how the script should or should not be used, how it should be simplified or not simplified. Okay, and a comment from Anne. Yes, the book on the Chinese typewriter. Yes, really, really interesting stuff. Let's take just a couple more questions.
I got a direct message question. Is there any credible history about Tamil script, Tamil language?
I don't know much about Tamil at all. I have two areas of weakness here, two layers of weakness rather. One is that, as I said before, as somebody who grew up in the West, I'm used to only using one script, and everything else, even though I do these carvings, is opaque to me at best. And the other is that even the research that I have done is limited because it's only limited to endangered alphabets or minority scripts. And so Tamil, being fairly widely used as a regional script in the southern part of South Asia, is one of many scripts about which I know pretty much nothing, except that I like it. It's a beautiful script.
Let's see. Olesh, by the use of Unicode in a weird emoticon way, do you think it will lead to some reclaiming of graphic forms of some letters?
Well, I think that graphic forms of some letters is already happening in terms of font creation, as I said. I think the other way in which the development of Unicode is playing a part in this is that because Unicode made the sort of landmark decision to include emoji, it means that we are now able to use different forms in the same sentence or even the same text for different purposes. And so when I'm texting with my daughter, for example, she can make some kind of factual statement that contains information that is probably better conveyed in in phonetic form in the Latin alphabet, but can then chuck in with a single keystroke an emoji which conveys instantly and graphically sort of a complex emotional response to what she's just typed. So Unicode has had that effect for sure, and it may have other effects, downstream.
Speaking of Unicode, here's a question I'm not sure I totally understand. Let's see, maybe you can. What can we do for Unicode as we have already a script called Aka in Magar?
Yes. So one of the things. So this was billed as a 5-part series, and even after the first talk, it became clear that I needed to add a sixth one, because there is such a debate going on right now, especially in South Asia, but to a lesser degree also in Africa, about the value and importance of creating new scripts specifically for certain languages that do not have their own writing system, and that up until now have either been forced to use a regional or a colonial writing system. And one of the bottlenecks, if you like, is the fact that the Unicode Consortium is actually approached by a lot of people saying, I've created a script for my language, I want it digitized and included in Unicode. And they're kind of going, oh dear, we've had 7 people from this same language community all coming up with different scripts. Which one do we go with? How do we know which one to use? Is there consistent use of this script throughout the community, or is it different? In which case, we have to figure out how to actually embody it in Unicode, because otherwise there'll be all kinds of confusion. So the 6th talk is going to be not a talk by me, but a discussion with invited guests from the Unicode Consortium, from the Central Indian Institute on Languages, and from people, some people actually who are in the process of creating or trying to popularize their script for their language community. So I will be sending out information about that talk ahead of time. But I think the last talk in this series is on February the 20th. So that means Sunday, February the 27th, we will have this great discussion on, where do we go now? If we accept, as many of you have said, that we want to go beyond the dominance and the hegemony of colonial or regionally powerful scripts, how do we then move forward? Okay, let's take one last question.
It's a very interesting question at the end here. Is it evolution to invent an alphabet for a language which was without an alphabet?
Well, that's a great question, but I think we've already said that evolution is a metaphor borrowed from biology. So if you like, then the question, if we replace that word, you say, is it an improvement to invent an alphabet for language which was without its alphabet? Let me tell you that the next week's talk is called Script Death, Script Birth. And we're going to address exactly that question then. And we're going to address the question, why would people go to all of the trouble and effort, and in some cases danger, of inventing alphabets for language that don't have them? We know of at least 4 people who were murdered for creating a script for their language community. So with that, I'm going to sign off. As I say, please support our Kickstarter. You will be getting an email talking about next week's talk, giving you a chance to register, giving you the link for the recording. So stand by, and that will be arriving in your email box. And I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.